My name is Melissa Smiley. I'm a special assistant and strategy officer with the Community Foundation. I also, with the assistance of many of my colleagues who you see in the room today, leading this new initiative the Community Foundation is calling Healthy Food Connect. The initiative has the goal of improving healthy food access for children and seniors in Southeast Michigan. I'll describe the initiative and the grant program that comes with it in detail later today, and you'll leave with more materials to read about it. In the meantime, we're gathered here today to learn about successful food programs nationally and locally. We're hopefully that you are seeing some old friends and maybe meeting some new ones in the crowd today. And we also are hopeful that you'll be able to think about what's possible in the future for healthy food access in the region. As Florine mentioned, we do want to thank the Michigan Health Endowment Fund for making this possible. We would also like to thank the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Fair Food Network, and Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems, who really offered critical insights as Healthy Food Connect was created and coming together. Our first speaker today is Amanda Navarro from PolicyLink. She holds a master's and a doctorate in public health and has published extensively on a number of issues, including potential policy-based impacts on inequities. When we started planning this kickoff, many people recommended her as a speaker. We're thrilled she flew in from New York to speak with us today. Amanda, come on up.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am thrilled to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much to the Michigan Health Endowment Fund, and in particular the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, and Melissa Smiley for the invitation. I am really excited about being here to talk to you today about how we can grow a sustainable and just food system in Southeast Michigan. And I know that there is a lot going on in Michigan, and it is both an exciting time and also a challenging time, and it is a pivotal moment for racial and economic equity. So before I start, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. I am born and raised in El Paso, Texas. I am Mexican American, and I grew up in a middle-class family in El Paso, and so I had the privilege of having a private education and of being able to get my master's and my doctorate. In El Paso, about 30 miles outside of El Paso city limits, is an unincorporated community called Fabens. And if you don't know what an unincorporated community is, it's a town or municipality that is actually not incorporated into the municipal grid. So that means that there is no formal water sewer system, no paved roads, and no streetlights. And so early on in my life, I was keenly aware of the deep racial and economic inequities that plagued our communities. And also realizing that not every community is a community that has full opportunity for all. So I feel blessed to be here in front of all of you today, to be able to talk with you, but more so to learn from you, to hear from you, and to be able to have a really meaningful dialogue about what it means to really take on and be all in for racial and economic equity in this region. So I wanted to just introduce PolicyLink for those of you that are not familiar with it. PolicyLink is a national research and action institute that advances economic and social equity by lifting up what works. So we believe that our nation's leaders are all of you, the local leaders. We are here to share your stories, lift up your wisdom and your voice, to be able to lift up models and examples of work that either have been successful or areas that don't work and why they don't work in order to really be able to advance innovative models. So I want to start by defining equity so that we're all on the same page about what we mean. PolicyLink defines equity as just and fair inclusion, in which everyone can participate and prosper and reach their full potential. And here you'll see that I've included 4 fundamental questions to equity. So I want you to hold these questions in mind today and when you leave and go back to your organization and your work, about are you really taking on equity, and ask yourself these 4 questions. Who benefits? Who pays or is harmed? Who leads? And who decides? Equity matters now more than ever. And so why is that? Well, there's several reasons. One is that the face of America is changing. As of 2013 in the United States, 39% of all Americans are people of color. Almost half of all children under the age of 18 are of color. And people of color have accounted for 98% of the population growth since then. And by 2044, the majority of people in this country will be people of color. Immigrants are also increasingly taking up residence and moving to job opportunities both in rural and urban settings, many of which are working at processing and meatpacking plants. And also we're seeing that in many regions and cities across the country, they're making a comeback from the decline of over many decades. But the fundamental question here, particularly around equity, is for whom are these regions coming back? The very same racial and ethnic groups that have been left behind are growing in number. And the reality is that many of them are continuing to still find that recovery, struggling and striving to provide for their children, while currently literally being displaced and pushed out. And it doesn't need to be that way. So how is Michigan changing? This is just one indication in one section of the greater region of Southeast Michigan, but just to give you some sense of how the demographics are shifting. In Michigan from 2000 to 2010, the Latino population had the highest growth rate. In Detroit, it was actually the Asian population that had the highest growth rate. And it's projected from 2010 to 2040 that the Asian population will have the highest growth rate both across the state and in this region, with a growth rate of about almost 130%. We also know that our current food system is not set up to benefit all. Every day, people struggle to find affordable food, to stay on their farms, and to earn a living wage. We also know that millions of Americans continue to lack access to healthy food. So think of our food system, every link of the food chain, production, distribution, retail, and even the consumers. Think about as we continue throughout the day, how do economic and racial inequities play out in each link of the food chain? And how can we really address those at each point? So given our current US farm policy, it's increasingly difficult, so this is on the production side, it's increasingly difficult for small family farms to compete. So we're seeing that many family farmers do not have many options to go into the local and regional markets to sell their produce. And small to mid-sized family farms really have 2 choices, which are not really choices at all. But one is to either go into contracts with large agricultural corporations, which really leaves them very little flexibility on how they grow their food, how they produce it, and even if they own their own seeds. But for those family farms that choose to not go into contracts with large agricultural corporations, they lack the benefit of large-scale operation and also lack access to the marketplace. And these are the same farmers that produce our fruits and vegetables. So they are not really reaping the rewards of any subsidies or insurance, and they're just one disaster away from bankruptcy. And this we're seeing cuts across all races, but in particular, farmers of color are being affected most abruptly. And we're even seeing in the recent case of the North Carolina black farmer, Eddie Weiss, his land being seized for being unable to pay on his loan that was exponentially increased. Now, as far as distribution, that's just as challenging. And it's actually one of the most hidden parts of the food chain. But communities across the country are suffering from the lack of supportive distribution infrastructure that prevents small local growers to connect to local buyers. And this is due to 75 years of consolidation and centralization of agriculture, food processing, and distribution and retailing. The latest USDA census shows that 8% of the farms account for 60% of agriculture sales. So for small farmers, that consolidation has resulted in really limited options for distribution and access to local markets to sell their produce. And what we're seeing then is that healthy, high-quality foods are not making it into many local communities, in particular underserved communities. And I can give other examples as far as the retail and consumers, and we're happy to have a conversation about that later. So in order for us to fundamentally transform the food system and to ensure sustainability, we need to really think about and emphasize ways of how to produce growth and also how to produce equity. So that means growing new food jobs, new food businesses, and also ensuring that everyone, particularly low-income communities and communities of color, can fully participate in generating that growth and also benefiting from that work. We also know that racial equity matters to transforming the food system. So current food systems are shaped by historical practices and policies that systematically have disenfranchised communities of color. We've seen that it's led to people being food insecure. It's played a role in raising vibrant communities and leaving in its wake empty parking lots, liquor stores, and poor housing. It has played a role in determining where resources go and where they don't. It's also determined which communities are slated for renewal and which ones we're seeing the flight of supermarkets and jobs from low-income neighborhoods. So in order to truly transform the food system in this region, we have to consider the ways in which racism has impacted the lives of people of color. Becoming an equitable food system means deeply embracing equity, thriving in the participation and creativity and contributions of everyone in the communities, and especially those that have long been left behind. And you have a critical role to play in that. This means addressing wide racial gaps in food, and it means being fully aware of the racial and economic barriers, and also establishing new rules to the game. It also means just talking about race and racism. The national outcry of events in Ferguson, Chicago, Baltimore, and more recently Flint has laid bare the deep-seated issues around race and opportunity that have plagued the communities that we work and live in. So race is front and center more so than ever, and without meaningful dialogue and sound policy solutions, the problems will persist and they'll get worse. So what does this mean? Where do we go from here? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, how do you operationalize and think about embedding equity into your work? Now, equity requires a set of nuanced strategies. So our task today and moving forward is for you to think about how do you embed equity into every policy and every strategy that you undertake. And equity is both the means and the end. It's both about what we want to achieve, but it's also how we do business. How do we work together? How do we interact? And I want to just take a moment and distinguish the difference between equity and equality. So think about it this way. Equality is if you give everyone a pair of shoes in this room. Equity is if I gave you a pair of shoes that fit. So not every policy solution, as it's made up, will fit for a particular community. So our challenge is to make sure that in each community that we work with, we give them a pair of shoes that fit for them. So the very first element of how do you think about equity is first really taking on the data. And I'll share a little bit of more data in a minute. But just to say that we really need to understand all of the aspects, the shapes and the sizes of equity. What does equity look like in each community? And being able to disaggregate that data by race, ethnicity, in addition to income and age and gender. But in addition to just looking at the data and what the inequities are, I want to also point out that it's important to also recognize the powerful assets and resources in these very communities, and having people bring voice to those assets, and also bringing voice to the solutions and how to create those solutions together. So here's just one example and one resource I highly recommend that you look into. It's PolicyMap, which was developed by the Reinvestment Fund. If you go to www.policymap.org, it gives a really great view of different indicators of the region. This one in particular is looking at low income and low access status of food markets as of 2010. So this shows low income tracts with at least 500 people living more than 0.5 miles, so that's in urban areas, or more than 10 miles in rural areas to the nearest supermarket. And you can actually zoom in much closer into the various pockets. But I show this just to show that we really need to understand place, the pockets that lack opportunity and access, and then being able to look into who are the people that live in these pockets and understanding what inequities they experience. Another resource is the National Equity Atlas, and this is actually a resource that PolicyLink, along with the University of Southern California, have been developing over the last couple of years. And this gives a very comprehensive data source to track and monitor the state of equity within your region. So I'm going to share a couple data points from our website. So I want to lift up some data points that relate to the food system. One is unemployment. As you can see here, regardless of education, the unemployment rate among the Black population is the highest. So even with those that have a BA or higher, the Black population has the highest unemployment rate at 9.8%. And then among those with a high school diploma but no college, the Black population has the highest unemployment rate at 25.63%. So really thinking about what are the barriers to employment? What are the barriers to employment in the food system? And really looking to remove those barriers that increase education and job training opportunities for all. Another is the current educational attainment in the metro region. So as of 2020, 44% of the jobs require an associate's degree or higher. And as you see here, those that exceed that average are both Asian-born and Asian immigrant, as well as you'll see the relative similar percentages among white US-born and white immigrant. And those that have the least amount, a percentage of associate's degree, are Black US-born, Latino-born, and Latino immigrant. So these disparities really say something about the future of the region and where there really needs to be some specificity and intentionality around really opening up pathways for education across different populations. Similarly, in the greater Detroit, Warren area, as of 2012, 16 to 24-year-olds that are neither in school nor working, the Black population had the highest share at 25%, almost 26%. Across the country, we're seeing youth, 16 to 24, our future workforce, that are neither connected to school nor a job. So I think there's a lot of conversation to be had, again, about how do we ensure that our future entrepreneurs and workers are set up successfully and connected to these opportunities. And lastly, looking at high poverty neighborhoods, and this is some indicator of segregation. As we see in 2012, the white population had the lowest concentration of people living in high poverty neighborhoods at 3%. But the Black population had the highest at 27%. So when people live in high poverty neighborhoods, They have less access to jobs and services, high quality education, parks and safe streets, and healthy food. And how do we really think about transforming what this statistic looks like? So part of the data is also understanding your own organization and the systems and the dynamics that you've set up. So rather than just looking out into the community, in addition, take a look at yourself internally. Are you as an organization and institution set up to be successful in achieving an equity? So for example, looking at your relationships with the community. Is there a troubled past history? Are there strong negative emotions? Do you really have the trust of the community in a way that will really ensure that you're working together in partnership to advance these efforts? There might be conflicts in data. How do you look at the data? How are you analyzing it? What type of data are you collecting? There might be conflicts around language, and not just language between a community and an institution, or just languages, English, Spanish, other languages, but also the way that we use our jargon in our various sectors and fields. How are public health people talking with planners or people that are on transportation boards? Do we all have the same language? Are we all talking about equity in the same way? And then there might be conflicts in values or conflicts structurally. So for example, who owns and controls the resources? What is the budget priority process like? Who has say as to where resources go? So a lot to really look into and assess as it relates to organizational systems and ensuring that you're actually not creating barriers to promoting equity. A second and equally as important component of equity is community engagement and leadership development. And we've seen time and again how vital it is for low-income people and people of color to be part of the process, to be the co-creators with you and able to create the solutions. And that as a result of engagement from the very beginning, time and again, you will see that there's opposition to those results and those plans moving forward. So meaningful engagement not only requires people coming to the table, but it also requires having those voices in governance and in the decision-making process. And another important distinction to make here, outreach is not engagement. So again, it's not about putting forth a plan or proposal when it's already been set up to say, hey, do you buy in and support this? It is about having community residents there with you in step from the beginning in creating a proposal or a plan together. So here's a structure that we developed to really sort of look at, well, what tables are you creating? So you'll see here there's different types of tables. The first is at the very bottom, they all have different value. So this is not to say there isn't value in all of these, but they've got different levels of value. So we love to hold town hall meetings, focus groups, all really good in obtaining input, but it's a one-time opportunity to be able to get and gather information from the community. As you move up the ladder, you see that where there's really opportunity to shift power, to have communities of color and low-income people change the way decisions are made, are at the governance level. So thinking about all of the multiple local boards and commissions and task force, who's sitting on those boards? Is there diversity? What's their inclusion process? How do we make sure that those that have not had a voice actually sit on those boards and commissions? Now, equally, the importance of having equity in policy, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides. So when you think about equity, we want to think about equity in all policies. How does a policy solution either perpetuate inequities or it helps to promote racial and economic equity? And when we think about equity in our policies, we really want to think about equitable approaches that result in the triple bottom line. So that means improving the health of the people in the place, revitalizing the neighborhoods, but ensuring that the people in those neighborhoods benefit and don't get displaced, and creating good quality jobs to be able to spur economic growth. So equitable policies really means that equity is a criteria for including or prioritizing a policy solution. It means identifying policies that are important to those communities. So this may mean that what you may think is an important policy solution is not important to the community. So it is our job to really think about how do we make sure that their priorities are met. And I'll just give you one example in a story. We worked with a foundation in the Northwest, and there were 3 funders that wanted to launch a food systems initiative. And when they got together, they realized that most of their investments had gone to food retail. So they thought, we really want to focus on the distribution and the production side. But before we do that, we're going to have conversations with the community. So they held several community forums, and they just had a very open dialogue and asked the question, so what's your number 1 policy priority? And to their surprise, the overwhelming response was obtaining driver's license for undocumented people. So the funders could have said, well, that's not food policy. That's outside the purview of what we want to do. But instead, they took that on and they turned it around and they said that's absolutely a food policy issue. That driver's license not only ensures that people can get to their jobs, it ensures that they can actually improve and increase their access to getting fruits and vegetables for their families. So the funders funded 3 advocacy organizations to then advocate for legislation. That legislation was passed by the state, and now undocumented people can obtain driver's license. So it's a really powerful story in thinking about how do you really work and have communities lead in informing what policy solutions they want to put in the forefront, and how we really change the narrative and create a framing in a way that really connects the issues in a different way. So here's a chart. I'm not going to go through it, but here's examples of the different types of opportunities that you can take to really thinking about food systems efforts and good food jobs. But I just want to lift up that some of these, in and of themselves, may not get to equity. Equity doesn't just happen. It has to be intentional focus to really advance it. So when we think about equitable approaches in the food system across the food chain, it might look like connecting to small and mid-sized farmers and producers, especially low-income farmers, prioritizing local farmers of color, choosing a location that maximizes equity impact. So for example, if there's a food hub and you're looking for a site for a facility, placing it in a low-income neighborhood or a community of color that can maximize and benefit from that facility. Employing members of the community, local hiring is so important to good food jobs. And also assessing the demand for different types of products. As we think about creating a culturally relevant product line or other different types of products that are offered to communities. So we are seeing across the country emerging models and existing models that are really moving forward and creating an equitable food system in regions across the country. And I know that in Michigan, you've got the Michigan Good Food Fund. I see Dwayne Wells, who's leading the Detroit Food and Fitness Collaborative, doing some phenomenal work there. So I would really love to hear from all of you on models that you think are really working to advance racial and economic equity, and also to hear from you about potential models that you think with some refinement and some intentionality could really have some high impacts on equity. But essentially it really boils down to 3 things. It boils down to growing good, accessible jobs, building capacities, creating pathways for connecting unemployed and underemployed workers, and to dismantle racial barriers and expand opportunity. I'm going to just give a couple examples. So in the production side of things, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, it really was started with farm worker community organizing, and they've now created a human rights organization. They've done two major campaigns. One is the Fair Food Program, in which they've partnered with farm workers, tomato growers, and retail buyers who pay 1 cent more per pound to increase worker wages. Has been extremely successful. And the second is the Campaign for Fair Food, which is bringing together farm workers and consumers, and they've combined an on-the-ground and also online organizing strategy to win fair food agreements. And this has been with Walmart, McDonald's, Subway, and Whole Foods to really bring forth more humane labor standards and fairer wages for farm workers. Now the second is in Cleveland, and this is the Cleveland Evergreen Cooperatives. Now this really exemplifies how anchor institutions like hospitals, universities, government agencies have really come together to orient and direct their spending power that spurs business development in a way that's really equitable and connecting low-income people of color to jobs. So the Evergreen Cooperative has launched 3 employee-owned businesses, and they're looking to launch up to 10 businesses. One is a laundry that's actually serving the anchor institutions. The next is a solar panel installation firm. And the third is an urban farm. As a result of their work over the last few years, they've employed and created over a dozen jobs with benefits and ownership opportunities for the employees, and those jobs, over half, have been to those that have felony records. So then you have Common Market in Philadelphia. This is a food hub that's serving the greater Philadelphia and southern New Jersey region. And this is really looking to connect the local growers with local buyers, as I mentioned before, the distribution, the disconnect in the distribution infrastructure. And as a result of their work, they've not only doubled their sales from $574,000 when they started in 2010 to over $1.3 million in 2012. They've sold more than $5 million in local fresh food, 25% of which has been sold to institutions serving low-income people and people of color. And they've also hired 16 full and part-time workers to staff the food hub, and 75% of the board represents people of color and residents from the community. And as of 2013, they opened up a 70,000 square foot warehouse facility in North Philadelphia, in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood, where the 2 founders started and where they lived. And this is bringing huge, spurring economic activity, sparking food entrepreneurs and food businesses, and now have a space to be able to launch their own product lines. And then lastly, in Oakland, the Mandela Marketplace. This opened up in 2009 with local leadership. This is an example of how community engagement really works. People from the community really coming together and creating a worker-owned enterprise in West Oakland and launching the first full-service grocery store. This has been in process for 10 years. They've been working, the marketplace has launched 10 years ago. So just to say that equity takes time, doesn't start and finish tomorrow. It spans the entire food system and has a huge emphasis on cooperative models of ownership. So you'll see that they also have generated $4 million in revenue with $1 million of sales in 2014 alone. They've created 25 jobs, all local residents. 640,000 pounds of local produce has gone to food insecure communities in Oakland. And over 700 residents have improved their eating habits. So I just want to end by reiterating that this is your moment, and it brings with it tremendous opportunity and responsibility. So seize this moment and put in a different place a model and approach that truly will achieve racial and economic equity in the food system. Equity has to be the fundamental way in which you plan and you design your efforts, and it must be a fundamental component to every dollar you spend and every brick and seed you put in place. And hold in mind that equitable outcomes don't just trickle in, but that equity has to be at the heart of all of your efforts. And it is not a zero-sum game. It is a win-win proposition. The more we invest in each other, we will all benefit. So when we lead with equity, we get it right for everyone. And it's going to take something from each of us to do that. So today and tomorrow and in the future, I urge you to be bold. I urge you to be visionary. I urge you to have conversations about how you truly change your behavior and how you go about your work in a way that will be all in for equity in Southeast Michigan. So thank you so much.